where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
What if the very thing you're hiding to protect someone is actually the prison keeping you both trapped? Here's a truth nobody wants to admit. Sometimes our biggest secrets aren't born from malice or shame, but from a twisted sense of love. We convince ourselves that silence is mercy, that keeping people in the dark is the ultimate act of care. But what if I told you that the walls we build to protect others are often just comfortable lies we tell ourselves to avoid the conflict of real honesty? This isn't just another love story from the age of dukes and duchesses. This is about a woman who made a choice that millions of us make every single day. She thought she was being noble, selfless even, carrying a secret that would change everything. And for 3 years, she lived with that choice, convinced she'd done the right thing. Until the moment when everything she'd carefully constructed came crashing down, and she realized that protection and control wear the same mask. You see, she believed her secret would remain hidden, buried deep where it could never hurt anyone, especially not the child she loved more than her own life, and definitely not the man who'd unknowingly given her that child during one unforgettable night before war took him away. She'd created an entire existence around this singular choice, moved to a distant village, rebuilt herself as someone new, and it worked for a while. That's the thing about secrets. They're like plants growing in darkness. They might seem manageable at first, easy to contain, but they have roots that spread deeper than we realize, reaching into every corner of our lives. She thought she was writing the story, controlling the narrative, deciding who knew what and when. But here's the paradox. Nobody tells you about secrets. The more energy you spend keeping them hidden, the more power they have over you. The person you think you're protecting, they're often just as trapped as you are, living half a life based on incomplete information. Now, before you judge her too harshly, ask yourself this. Have you ever kept something from someone because you convinced yourself it was for their own good? Maybe it wasn't a child, but perhaps it was a truth about their partner, a financial struggle, a health diagnosis, or even just your real feelings about something that mattered. We've all been there, standing at that crossroads where honesty feels too dangerous and silence feels like love. The problem is, we rarely consider that the other person might be strong enough to handle the truth, or that they might actually want the burden we're trying to spare them from. She made her choice in a moment of fear and supposed nobility. He was going to war. She had nothing to offer. Society would destroy them both. All logical reasons, all seemingly justified. But logic and fear make terrible co-pilots when you're trying to navigate something as complex as love and parenthood. And that's exactly where this story gets interesting. Because what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that he'd spent those same 3 years searching for her, tormented by guilt, convinced he'd done something unforgivable. Here's where it gets really uncomfortable, and why you need to hear this story. The conspiracy we create in our own minds about what's best for others is often just our fear dressed up as wisdom. Think about it. How many relationships, friendships, or family connections are built on carefully managed codes of what can and cannot be said? We tiptoe around truth like it's a forbidden weapon, when in reality, it might be the bridge we're desperately needing to cross. She thought keeping her son away from his father was protecting them both from scandal and responsibility. He thought her disappearance was punishment for something he'd done wrong. Both were trapped in narratives they'd created alone, never stopping to consider that the other person might be writing a completely different story. And their son? He was growing up with a mystery where his father should be, sensing the vestiges of truth in every careful deflection, every avoided question. 3 people, all suffering, all protected by a secret that was supposed to make everything easier. But secrets have a way of demanding their own revelation, don't they? No matter how carefully you guard them, no matter how many walls you build or miles you put between yourself and the truth, life has a way of forcing confrontation. For her, it came in the form of her son's sudden illness, a fever that wouldn't break, and the terrible realization that saving his life meant returning to the very place she'd fled. The capital, where the Duke now lived, searching for a wife while unknowingly having a son he'd never met. Imagine that moment, having to choose between maintaining your carefully constructed silence or saving the life of the person that silence was supposed to protect. That's not a choice. That's a reckoning. And it's the kind of moment that reveals what our priorities really are when everything else is stripped away. Suddenly, all her logical reasons, all her justified fears, became irrelevant in the face of genuine crisis. Because here's what she learned, and what we all eventually learn if we're paying attention. The things we hide to protect love often become the very things that prevent love from being real. So what happened when she walked back into that world, carrying her secret literally in her arms? What did the Duke do when he finally saw the truth she'd kept hidden for 3 years? That's what this story is really about. Not just the romance or the drama of aristocratic life, but the fundamental question of whether honesty, even devastating honesty, is better than comfortable lies. And here's the revelation that might change how you think about your own life. Sometimes the storm we're so desperately trying to avoid is actually the only way to clear the air. She thought confrontation would destroy everything. She thought the truth would be the end of any possible future. But what if the truth, messy and painful as it was, turned out to be the beginning of something more real than anything built on silence could ever be? What if the thing she feared most was actually the freedom they'd all been unconsciously seeking? This isn't just a historical tale about people in fancy clothes making dramatic decisions. This is about the choices we make every single day. The truths we withhold because we think we're being kind. The secrets we carry because we've convinced ourselves that revelation would hurt more than concealment. The walls we build between ourselves and the people we love, calling it protection when it's really just fear. And if you've ever felt that weight, that constant vigilance of maintaining a story that isn't quite complete, then you understand exactly what she went through. The question isn't whether she should have told him from the beginning. That's easy to judge from the outside. The real question is, what are you keeping hidden in your own life? And who are you really protecting? Because I guarantee you, just like in this story, the person on the other side of your silence is probably writing their own narrative, filling in the gaps with assumptions that might be completely wrong. And both of you are suffering for a protection neither of you actually wanted. Here's what you're about to discover in this story. Not just how a secret unraveled, but why the mystery we create is often more damaging than the truth we're hiding. You'll see how 2 people who genuinely cared for each other spent 3 years in unnecessary pain because neither had the courage to be vulnerable first. You'll understand how a child can sense the hidden truths in a parent's careful words, even when nothing explicit is said. And most importantly, you'll witness what happens when all those carefully constructed walls finally come down. Not in the dramatic, destructive way we fear, but in a way that's somehow both messier and more hopeful than either of them expected. Because that's the real paradox of truth. It's simultaneously the thing we fear most and the thing we need most. It destroys the comfortable lies we've been living, yes, but it also creates space for something more authentic to grow. And isn't that what we're all really searching for? Not perfection, not the absence of problems, but but genuine connection built on truth rather than fear. The grand ballroom shimmered under 1,000 candles, their light dancing across silk gowns and polished marble floors. It was one of those evenings where secrets seemed to hang in the air like expensive perfume. Everyone had one, but no one dared acknowledge it. She stood near the edge of the crowd, observing rather than participating, when she first noticed him. The Duke wasn't just another nobleman. There was something different about his presence, something that felt like an enigma wrapped in aristocratic composure. He moved through the room with the ease of someone who knew every hidden rule, every unspoken code of their world. And when his eyes met hers across that sea of guests, she felt it. That unmistakable pull that changes everything. You know that feeling, right? When someone looks at you, and suddenly the whole room shrinks to just the two of you. What happened next wasn't the fairy tale you'd expect. He approached her, yes, but his invitation to dance came with an edge she hadn't anticipated. "My lady," he said, extending his hand with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've heard whispers about your family's recent difficulties. Perhaps a dance might silence some of those vestiges of gossip. See, this is where most stories would paint him as the charming prince. But real life, even fictional real life, is far more complex." As they moved across the floor, their conversation was a carefully choreographed conflict of wits. He'd make a comment about the weather, but she'd hear the question beneath it. She'd compliment the music, and he'd catch the deflection. Talking with him was like playing chess with someone who'd already mapped out your next 3 moves. It was intimidating, sure, but here's the thing. It was also completely addictive. When's the last time someone actually challenged you instead of just agreeing with everything you said? The dance floor became their private battlefield, and with each turn, each carefully placed step, she found herself drawn deeper into this dangerous game. There's something intoxicating about being intellectually matched, about finding someone who doesn't just accept your carefully constructed walls, but sees right through them. "You're very careful with your words, my lady," he observed, his voice low enough that only she could hear over the orchestra. "What are you so afraid people might discover?" The question hung between them like a forbidden truth, one that made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with the dance. She could have deflected again, could have smiled and changed the subject like she'd done 1,000 times before. But something about the way he looked at her, not with judgment, but with genuine curiosity, made her want to lower her guard. "Perhaps," she whispered back, "I'm afraid they'll discover there's nothing particularly interesting to hide." Here's where the story gets real, where the carefully maintained facades start to crack. The Duke, this man who seemed to have all the answers, who carried himself like someone who'd never known vulnerability, did something unexpected. He missed a step, just slightly, barely noticeable to anyone watching, but she felt it. And in that brief moment of imperfection, she saw something that would change everything. He was just as lost as she was. "I apologize," he said, and for the first time that evening, his smile was genuine. "I find myself distracted. You're not what I expected." The admission was small, almost insignificant, but it created a crack in his armor that she couldn't ignore. See, this is the mystery of human connection. Sometimes it's not the grand gestures that win us over, but the tiny moments of honest imperfection. When someone powerful enough to hide everything chooses to show you even a glimpse of their true self, it's like they're handing you a code to understand them. The ballroom eventually faded away. Not literally, of course, but in the way that everything else becomes background noise when you're having a real conversation with someone who matters. They found themselves on a terrace overlooking the gardens, the silence between them now comfortable rather than tense. He spoke of the pressures of his title, the expectations that felt like chains, the loneliness of always having to be the strongest person in the room. She shared pieces of her own story, the family debts, the social scrutiny, the exhaustion of maintaining appearances. It wasn't planned, this exchange of truths. It just happened. And that's often how the most important connections form, isn't it? Not through calculated strategy, but through those unexpected moments when two people accidentally become honest with each other. Think about your own life. The people you're closest to probably aren't the ones you tried hardest to impress. As the evening wore on and the storm clouds gathered outside, something shifted between them. The rain started as a whisper, then grew into a downpour that sent the other guests scurrying inside. But they stayed on that terrace, watching the hidden garden transform under the deluge. "I should go inside," she said, though neither of them moved. "Should you?" he asked, and the question carried a weight that had nothing to do with the weather. Here's what nobody tells you about life-changing moments. They rarely announce themselves with trumpets and fanfare. Instead, they slip in quietly, disguised as ordinary choices. Stay or go. Speak or remain silent. Trust or protect yourself. She chose to stay, and in doing so, chose to let someone past walls she'd spent years building. The night that followed wasn't about grand romantic gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about two people finding unexpected safety in each other's honesty. There was indeed a tempest raging outside, the kind that makes windows rattle and trees bend. But for the first time in years, she felt genuinely safe. Not because he promised to solve her problems or rescue her from her circumstances. That's not how real connection works. She felt safe because, in his presence, she didn't have to pretend. She could be afraid and strong, confident and uncertain, all at once. They talked until the storm passed and dawn began painting, the sky in shades of pink and gold. He told her about the conspiracy of expectations that came with his title, how everyone assumed strength meant never admitting doubt. She shared her own battles, the ways society's rigid codes felt suffocating. And somewhere in those hours, something profound happened. They stopped being the Duke and the lady and simply became two people who saw each other clearly. That's the revelation most of us spend our whole lives seeking, isn't it? Someone who sees us completely and doesn't look away. But morning brought reality crashing back with cruel efficiency. As the first rays of sunlight touched the terrace where they'd spent the night talking, a messenger arrived with urgent news. The Duke was being called to war, effective immediately. His regiment was deploying within hours. There was no time for long goodbyes, no opportunity to make promises or plans. He had to leave, and she had to let him go, both of them carrying the weight of a connection that felt unfinished. "I'll return," he said simply. But they both knew war made liars of even the most sincere intentions. She watched him ride away as the sun rose higher, his figure eventually disappearing into the morning mist. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that weeks later, she'd discover she was carrying a piece of him with her. And that secret would reshape everything she thought she knew about herself, about him, and about the impossible choices love sometimes demands. She stood at the window of her small cottage, watching the rain trace patterns on the glass, and made a decision that would define the next 3 years of her life. It was the kind of choice many of us would make when faced with impossible circumstances. Protect. But here's the question that kept her awake at night. Protect whom exactly? The child growing inside her from a life of rejection and whispers? Or him from a responsibility he'd never asked for, thrust upon him in a single night before war swept him away? There's no guidebook for this, you know. No manual that tells you how to navigate loving someone while carrying their secret in a way that changes your entire existence. She chose silence, not out of spite or fear alone, but from something far more complex, a twisted sense of mercy. He'd never asked for, thrust upon him in a single night before war swept him away. There's no guidebook for this, you know. No manual that tells you how to navigate loving someone while carrying their secret in a way that changes your entire existence. She chose silence, not out of spite or fear alone, but from something far more complex, a twisted sense of mercy. Maybe you've been there too, making decisions for others because you thought you knew what was best, only to realize years later that protection and control sometimes wear the same mask. The move to the distant village happened quietly, like most disappearances that matter. She didn't announce her departure or explain her reasons. She simply vanished from society's radar, becoming one of those cautionary tales whispered about at dinner parties. "Did you hear about the lady who left everything behind?" they'd murmur, creating their own narratives to fill the enigma she'd left behind. But the truth was far less scandalous and far more human. She found a small cottage on the edge of a village where nobody knew her title, her family, or her past. Here, she could simply be a woman preparing for motherhood, free from the weight of expectations and judgment. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself, wasn't the grand estate or the social gatherings, but it was hers, and sometimes that's enough. Think about it. How many of us cling to lives we've outgrown simply because starting over feels too daunting? Those first months alone taught her things no finishing school ever could. Being a mother without a partner is like being a gardener of a single rare flower. You're constantly terrified of doing too much or too little. You water because you're afraid it'll dry out, then panic that you've drowned it. You give it sunlight, then worry the heat is too intense. Every decision feels monumental because there's no one to share the burden of possibly getting it wrong. When her son was born on a cold winter morning, she held him and saw traces of his father in every feature. The strong jawline, the intense eyes, even the way his tiny fingers curled with determination. It was beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. She named him without the Duke's input, chose his first clothes, sang his first lullabies, all while carrying the vestiges of what might have been if circumstances were different. The years unfolded in a rhythm of small joys and constant vigilance. Her son grew strong and curious, asking questions that became harder to answer as he developed awareness. "Where's my father?" became a recurring theme, each iteration cutting a little deeper. At first, she could distract him with stories or redirect his attention. But children aren't foolish. They sense the hidden truths we try to keep from them. By his third birthday, he'd stopped asking directly, but started watching other families with an intensity that broke her heart. She'd see him at the village square, observing fathers with their sons, trying to understand what piece of himself was missing. Here's what nobody tells you about keeping secrets from children. They don't need words to know something's wrong. They feel it in your hesitations, see it in your careful deflections, sense it in the way you change the subject when certain topics arise. The guilt she carried wasn't just about the Duke. It was about her son, growing up with a mystery where his father should be. Meanwhile, rumors drifted to her village like autumn leaves blown by distant winds. The Duke had returned from war, they said. He'd survived when so many hadn't, coming back decorated and changed. The whispers spoke of a man harder than before, more closed off, as if he'd left parts of himself on those battlefields. And then came the news that made her hands shake as she kneaded bread one ordinary morning. He was looking for a wife. The local baker's wife, always eager to share gossip, described the parade of suitable ladies being presented to him, each one more accomplished than the last. Such a catch, the woman sighed dreamily. Any woman would be fortunate to become his duchess. She smiled politely and said nothing, but inside, something cracked. The conflict between what she'd chosen and what she'd lost had never felt more acute. What twisted the knife deeper were the descriptions of how he'd changed. People said his eyes held a distant quality now, as if he was always looking for something just beyond reach. He was courteous to the ladies presented to him, but never engaged, going through the motions without any real interest. It's like he's searching for someone specific, one traveler mentioned, passing through her village. But no one knows who. She wanted to believe these were just stories, embellished tales meant to add romance to mundane aristocratic matchmaking. But a small, forbidden part of her wondered, could he be looking for her? Had that single night meant as much to him as it had to her? The thought was dangerous because it made her question everything, made her wonder if her protection had actually been a prison for them both. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't making a difficult choice. It's living with it long enough to see all its consequences unfold. Her son continued growing, developing traits that felt like codes spelling out his true heritage to anyone paying attention. He had his father's analytical mind, the way he'd observe situations before acting, calculating risks like a tiny chess player. He had that same intensity when interested in something, that focus that shut out the rest of the world. The village children adored him for his natural leadership, but she saw something else. The loneliness of being different, of sensing you don't quite fit the story you've been told about yourself. On his 3rd birthday, he did something that made her breath catch. He arranged his toy soldiers in perfect military formation, explaining complex strategies he couldn't possibly have learned from her. "That's how you win battles," he announced with certainty. "You have to think 3 steps ahead." Those were almost the exact words she'd used to describe his father, back when she thought of him as a chess player who knew her moves before she made them. The revelation she feared most wasn't coming from outside scrutiny. It was building from within, in the form of a child who'd eventually demand answers she wasn't sure how to give. How do you explain to a little boy that his father exists but doesn't know about him? That you chose silence over truth because you thought it was best? She practiced conversations in her head, tried different approaches, but none felt right. And then, one evening as she tucked him into bed, he said something that changed everything. "Mama, when I grow up, I'm going to find all the lost things." She asked what he meant, and he looked at her with those eyes, his father's eyes, and said, "The things people are too scared to look for." At 3 years old, he couldn't possibly understand the weight of what he'd said, but she felt it like a prophecy. The secrets she'd kept were already beginning to seek their own revelation, and she sensed that her carefully constructed world of silence was about to face its greatest test. The fever came suddenly, as these things often do, turning her world upside down in the span of a single afternoon. Her son had been playing in the garden, laughing and building imaginary fortresses, when he suddenly collapsed. By evening, his small body burned with a heat that terrified her, his breathing shallow and labored. The village doctor came, examined him with furrowed brows, and delivered words that felt like a death sentence. "This is beyond my skill. There's a physician in the capital, trained in the new methods from the continent. He's the only one who might save the boy." The silence that followed was deafening. Return to the capital? Walk back into the world she'd fled, carrying the very secret she'd spent 3 years protecting? But what choice did she have? Sometimes life backs us into corners where all our careful plans, all our protective walls crumble in the face of what truly matters. And what mattered was the small, fragile life burning up with fever in her arms. The journey to the capital was a nightmare wrapped in urgency. She held her son close, feeling his heart race against her chest, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "You'll be all right, my love. Mama will fix this." But with each mile that brought them closer to the city, another kind of fear grew. The fear of exposure, of recognition, of the carefully constructed life she'd built shattering like glass. Here's something most people don't understand about desperation. It strips away everything except what's essential. Pride, dignity, self-preservation, all of it becomes meaningless when someone you love is slipping away. She'd spent 3 years avoiding this moment, building an entire existence around never having to face him again. Yet here she was, voluntarily walking back into the enigma she'd created. Because sometimes, love for your child overrides even the deepest fears. Have you ever had to choose between two impossible things? It's not heroic. It's just what you do when there's no other option. Imagine carrying your greatest secret literally in your arms while walking through the very halls where it all began. The capital hadn't changed much. Same grand buildings, same aristocratic air, same suffocating sense of being watched and judged. But she'd changed everything. She was no longer the lady who'd attended balls and played society's games. She was a mother, desperate and determined, with no concern for propriety or appearances. Every step through those marble corridors felt like a confession waiting to happen. She could feel eyes on her, recognition flickering in some faces, questions forming in others. Isn't that? Where has she been? Who's the child? The whispers followed her like a shadow, but she kept moving forward, her son's fevered breathing the only thing that mattered. This is what courage actually looks like. Not the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it threatening to consume you. And then it happened. She saw him before he saw her. The Duke stood at the far end of the corridor, deep in conversation with another nobleman. And the sight of him, after 3 years, hit her like a physical blow. He looked different. Older, yes, but also harder somehow, as if war had carved away everything soft and left only edges. His jaw was set in that familiar way, his posture perfect, but there was something in his bearing that spoke of burdens carried alone. For a heartbeat, she considered turning around, finding another route, maintaining the silence she'd protected for so long. But her son whimpered in her arms, reminding her why she'd come. She took a breath and kept walking. That's when he looked up. Their eyes met across that crowded hallway, and she watched recognition dawn in his face. First confusion, then shock, then something more complex that she couldn't quite read. He saw her first, and in that moment, the entire world seemed to stop. She watched his expression shift through emotions too quick to name. Surprise, disbelief, something that looked almost like relief before settling into confusion. He took a step toward her, then another, and she instinctively held her son closer, as if that could somehow hide the truth that was about to shatter everything. "My lady," he began, his voice carrying that same timbre she'd heard in her dreams for 3 years. "You disappeared." The word hung between them, loaded with accusation and hurt and questions. She wanted to run, every instinct screaming at her to turn and flee, but her feet wouldn't move. "I had to," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. It wasn't the explanation he deserved. Wasn't even close. But it was all she could manage with their secret burning with fever in her arms and the weight of 3 years of choices pressing down on her shoulders. Then it happened. The moment she'd dreaded and somehow knew was inevitable. Her son, delirious with fever, stirred in her arms and called out softly, "Mama!" That single word, spoken in a child's voice, cut through the tension like a blade. She watched the Duke freeze, his eyes moving from her face to the bundle in her arms, really looking for the first time. She saw the exact moment understanding began to dawn. His eyes widening slightly, his jaw tightening, his entire body going rigid. You could almost see the calculations happening behind those intense eyes, the mental mathematics of months and timing. His gaze darted back to her face, searching for confirmation or denial, but she had nothing left to hide behind. The vestiges of her carefully maintained deception crumbled in the face of his scrutiny. 3 years of silence was about to end, and she wasn't sure either of them was ready for what came next. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing she'd ever experienced. It pressed down on them both, thick with unspoken accusations and forbidden truths. People moved around them in the corridor, going about their business, completely unaware that they were witnessing the collision of 2 worlds kept deliberately separate. The Duke's face had gone pale, his eyes never leaving the child in her arms. She could see him doing the math, counting backward, putting pieces together. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the only outward sign of the storm she knew must be raging inside him. "How old?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of 1,000 questions. "3," she answered, and watched that single word hit him like a physical blow. 3 years, he repeated slowly, and she couldn't tell if it was a question or an accusation, or simply disbelief. You know that moment before you jump into water from a high place? When you've already committed, already left the safety of solid ground, but haven't yet felt the impact? That's exactly where she stood, suspended between the secret she'd kept and the revelation that was coming. She'd already exposed everything without saying a word, and now there was nothing to do but wait for the inevitable crash. The Duke stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the child's face, and she saw something shift in his expression. Not anger, not rejection, something far more complicated. He started, then stopped, swallowing hard. He looks like... Again, the words failed him, but she understood. Their son carried pieces of both of them, a living testament to a night 3 years ago when 2 people found unexpected connection in a storm. The conspiracy of her silence, the hidden truth she'd maintained, all of it was unraveling in this hallway, and she couldn't stop it even if she wanted to. Because sometimes the truth has its own timeline, its own inevitability, and all our careful planning can't hold it back forever. The only question now was, what would he do with it? The Duke's private study felt smaller than she remembered. Or perhaps it was just the weight of 3 years of secrets pressing in from all sides. He'd insisted they speak privately after ensuring her son was taken to the physician. His physician, summoned immediately with an authority that reminded her exactly who he was in this world. Now they stood on opposite sides of an ornate desk, and the silence between them crackled with everything unsaid. 3 years, he finally spoke, his voice low and controlled in that dangerous way that meant he was barely holding back. 3 years you kept this from me. 3 years I could have... He stopped, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration she'd never seen from him before. Why? The single word carried the weight of 1,000 questions, and she knew whatever answer she gave would never be enough, but she had to try. "I wasn't going to trap you," she said, lifting her chin despite the tears threatening to fall. "You were going to war. You had duties, responsibilities. I wasn't going to burden you with a child you never asked for, from a night that was supposed to be just a moment." His reaction wasn't what she expected. Instead of relief or gratitude for being spared the burden, anger flashed across his face. Real, raw anger that made him look more alive than the controlled aristocrat he usually presented. "Burden," he repeated, his voice rising. "You thought—" He laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitterness. "Do you have any idea what I went through? I came back from war, and you were gone, vanished without a trace." Here's the thing about assumptions. We make them to protect ourselves, to write narratives that make sense of chaos, but we rarely consider that the other person might be writing a completely different story. She'd spent 3 years convinced she was doing him a favor, while he'd spent the same time thinking he'd done something unforgivable. She felt the tears break free then, streaming down her face as years of carefully maintained composure crumbled. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I had nothing to offer him. My family was in debt. My reputation was already fragile. What kind of life would that have been for a child? Growing up knowing his father was forced into responsibility, his mother a social pariah." The words tumbled out, all the justifications she'd told herself during 3 years of silence. "I did it to protect him, to protect you, to protect all of us from a situation that would have made everyone miserable." But even as she spoke them, the words sounded hollow, like the code she'd been following didn't quite translate in the harsh light of confrontation. Sometimes the rules we create to protect ourselves end up being the very cages that trap us. And standing there, watching pain and anger war across his face, she wondered if her protection had actually been control disguised as mercy. What happened next shifted everything. The Duke turned away from her, his shoulders tense, and walked to where her son lay sleeping on a cushioned settee, the fever finally broken thanks to the physician's intervention. She watched, her heart in her throat, as he knelt beside the child, really studying him for the first time. The anger seemed to drain from his posture, replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. With hesitant movements, as if afraid the boy might break, he reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from the child's forehead. The tenderness of the gesture made her breath catch. "He has your nose," he said quietly, almost to himself. "And your stubborn chin." Then he carefully, so carefully, picked up the sleeping child. Her son stirred slightly but didn't wake, settling naturally against the Duke's chest, as if he somehow recognized safety. The silence this time was different, not heavy with accusation, but weighted with something else entirely. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of acceptance. She watched, transfixed, as this powerful man who commanded armies and influenced kingdoms cradled their son with a gentleness that shattered her remaining defenses. "He has my eyes," the Duke observed, his voice thick with emotion. "But I see your courage in how he holds himself, even in sleep. That determination." He looked up at her then, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "What's his name?" The question was simple, but loaded with everything. 3 years of missed moments, of firsts he'd never witnessed, of a child growing up without knowing his father. "Alexander," she whispered. "I named him Alexander." The Duke nodded slowly, testing the name silently. "Alexander," he repeated, and the way he said it, like a prayer or a promise, made something shift in the room. This wasn't about anger anymore, or accusations, or even the past. This was about a father meeting his son for the first time, and everything that meant for all their futures. Think about the mysteries we create in our own lives, the walls we build thinking we're protecting people, when maybe we're just protecting ourselves from the conflict of real connection. Then came the revelation that changed everything she thought she knew about the past 3 years. The Duke looked at her, still holding their son, and said words she never expected to hear. "That night wasn't casual for me." His voice was quiet but firm, each word deliberate. "I know it might have seemed that way, with the dance and the verbal sparring, but it wasn't. I'd noticed you long before that ball, watched you navigate society with a grace that seemed effortless, but I knew cost you everything." He paused, adjusting his hold on Alexander. "When you disappeared, I spent 3 years searching. Not out of obligation or duty, but because I thought I'd lost something irreplaceable." The admission hung in the air like a forbidden truth finally spoken. "I convinced myself you'd fled, because I'd overstepped, been too forward, made you uncomfortable. The guilt of possibly hurting you consumed me." She stared at him, her entire understanding of the past 3 years crumbling. All this time, she'd thought she was protecting him from unwanted responsibility, while he'd been tormented by thinking he'd driven her away. The weight of their mutual misunderstanding settled over them both. "We're both fools," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I spent 3 years hiding to protect you from a burden you apparently wanted. You spent 3 years blaming yourself for something that never happened. It would have been almost funny if it weren't so tragic. 2 people who'd found genuine connection, then spent years apart based on assumptions and fears rather than truth." "Sometimes," the Duke said, gently laying Alexander back on the settee and covering him with a blanket, "we prepare so thoroughly for the storm that we forget to check if the person on the other side is actually trying to hurt us, or if they're just looking for someone to weather it with." He turned to face her fully. "You built walls, thinking I wanted distance. I built walls, thinking I'd already pushed you away. We were both so busy protecting ourselves that we never considered we might have wanted the same thing, to face the storm together. It's one of life's cruelest ironies, isn't it? The secrets we keep to protect love often end up being the very things that keep love at bay." The air between them felt different now, charged not with anger, but with possibility. Fragile and uncertain, but real. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Duke looked at their sleeping son, then back at her, and something like determination settled over his features. "Now," he said quietly, "we stop running from storms and start learning to stand in them together. Now we give Alexander what we both lacked: honesty. Now we figure out how to build something real instead of hiding behind what we think we should do." He stepped closer to her, and she didn't move away. "It won't be easy. There will be scandal, judgment, questions we'll have to answer. But I've spent 3 years in a war far from home, and you know what I learned? The only battles worth fighting are the ones for something that actually matters." His hand reached out, hovering near hers, an invitation rather than a demand. "Does this matter to you? The truth of it, messy and complicated as it is?" And standing there, with their son sleeping peacefully nearby, and 3 years of hidden truth finally laid bare, she realized that sometimes the revelation we fear most is actually the freedom we've been searching for all along. So here's the real question. What are you going to do with this knowledge? Because understanding this story intellectually is one thing, but applying it to your own life? That's where the real transformation happens. Think about it right now, honestly. What secret are you carrying that's supposedly protecting someone, but might actually be keeping both of you trapped in a half-truth? What conversation are you avoiding because you've convinced yourself that silence is kinder than honesty? I'm not saying every secret needs to be shouted from the rooftops, but I am asking you to examine whether your protection is actually love, or whether it's just fear wearing a noble disguise. Because here's what this story proves. The conflicts we avoid don't disappear. They just grow hidden roots that eventually strangle everything we're trying to protect. Let me be direct with you, because we've come this far together, and you deserve honesty. How many more years are you willing to spend managing a narrative instead of living an authentic life? How much energy will you continue pouring into maintaining walls when that same energy could be building bridges? She wasted 3 years convinced she was doing the right thing, and he wasted 3 years tormented by guilt for something he didn't even do. Their son grew up with a mystery where his father should be. 3 people, all suffering unnecessarily, all trapped by a choice that was supposed to make everything easier. Is that what you want for your life? For your relationships? For the people you claim to love? Because every day you choose silence over truth is another day you're writing a story for someone else without their permission, deciding what they can and cannot handle, playing a role that was never meant to be yours. Here's what I want you to do, and I mean actually do, not just think about doing. Take one secret, just one, that you've been carrying because you think revelation would cause more harm than concealment. Examine it honestly. Ask yourself, am I really protecting this person, or am I protecting myself from the discomfort of honesty? Am I preventing their pain, or am I just avoiding the conflict that truth might bring? Write it down if you need to. Say it out loud to yourself in a mirror. Practice the conversation you're afraid to have. Because the longer you wait, the deeper those roots grow, and the harder it becomes to unearth the truth without causing damage. She learned this the hard way. Sometimes the revelation you fear most is actually the freedom everyone's been unconsciously craving. But you'll never know if you don't take that terrifying step toward honesty. And let's talk about the people in your life who might be keeping secrets from you with the same misguided sense of protection. Are you making space for truth? Or are you so fragile in their eyes that they feel they have to manage you? Because that's the other side of this coin. Sometimes we're not the secret keeper. We're the one being protected. And that's its own kind of prison. Create relationships where people feel safe being honest with you, even when that honesty is uncomfortable. Stop rewarding comfortable lies with your approval. Stop punishing vulnerability with judgment. The Duke and she both built walls thinking the other wanted distance, when really they both wanted the same thing. Someone brave enough to weather storms together instead of alone. What walls have you built that are actually keeping out the very connection you're seeking? What codes of acceptable conversation are you enforcing that prevent real intimacy from developing? This isn't just about romantic relationships either. This applies to your family, your friendships, your professional life, every connection that matters. How many parents keep secrets from their children for their own good, never considering that children sense those vestiges of truth anyway? How many friendships are built on carefully curated versions of ourselves rather than genuine authenticity? How many work relationships operate on unspoken conspiracies of what can and cannot be acknowledged? The pattern is everywhere once you start looking for it, and it's slowly suffocating the potential for real connection in almost every area of our lives. The enigma isn't why relationships fail. It's why we're surprised when relationships built on partial truths eventually crumble under the weight of everything left unsaid. So I'm challenging you, no, I'm daring you, to be the one who breaks the cycle. Be the person who chooses difficult honesty over comfortable lies. Be brave enough to have the conversation you've been avoiding. Be strong enough to handle truth when others finally feel safe enough to share it with you. Yes, it will be messy. Yes, there will be conflict. Yes, some people might react in ways you don't expect or don't like. But you know what the alternative is? More years of managed narratives, more energy spent maintaining silence, more relationships operating at half capacity because nobody's willing to risk being fully known. Is that really how you want to spend the limited time you have? Because life doesn't wait for you to feel ready for truth. It forces confrontation eventually. And the longer you wait, the higher the cost of revelation becomes. What would change in your life if you stopped playing it safe? If you stopped managing other people's emotions and trusted them to handle their own truth? If you demanded the same honesty from others that you're now committed to giving? I'll tell you what would change: everything. Your relationships would either deepen into something more authentic, or they'd reveal themselves as connections that only worked because nobody was being real. Both outcomes are valuable, even though only one feels comfortable. Because knowing where you actually stand with people is infinitely more useful than maintaining pleasant illusions. The mystery of whether someone truly knows and accepts you, or whether they just love the carefully curated version you present, that ambiguity is its own kind of torture. Why not find out the truth? Why not give people the chance to love the real you instead of the protected version? Here's your final challenge, and this is where I want you to really engage with this. Comment below and tell me, what's one truth you've been keeping hidden, and what's the real reason you haven't shared it? You don't have to name names or give identifying details, but be honest about the pattern. Is it fear of rejection? Fear of conflict? Fear of losing control of the narrative? Or is it something else entirely? Maybe you've been carrying it so long that it's become part of your identity, and you're not sure who you'd be without it? Share your story, because I guarantee someone else reading this is carrying a similar burden and needs to know they're not alone. Let's create a space where honesty isn't just encouraged, but celebrated, where the forbidden truths we've all been carrying can finally see light. And if you found value in this story, if it made you think differently about the secrets you're carrying or the walls you've built, then subscribe to this channel and activate those notifications. Because this is just the beginning of exploring these uncomfortable truths, these patterns we all recognize but rarely discuss. There's so much more to uncover about how we navigate relationships, authenticity, and the courage it takes to live honestly in a world that often rewards performance over truth. Don't let this be just another video you watched and forgot. Let it be the catalyst for actual change in your life. The revelation you need might be one honest conversation away, but you'll never know if you don't take that first terrifying step. So, what's it going to be? More years of comfortable silence, or the messy, beautiful truth that could set you free?